Welcome back to another box-smashing, baddie-bashing, crash-landing episode of What Happened, the show that constantly pops up in your recommended feed despite you not knowing why. On this week's episode... What? Oh, I've already used that opening joke before? Okay, who cares? It was like 50 episodes ago. Anyway, this week we'll be dipping our toes for the first, but I'm sure not the last time in the murky marsupial waters of the Crash Bandicoot franchise. For those too young to remember, i.e. Liam, Crash was the platforming mascot that the lowly Mario was always ducking, as he would certainly get battered by the Bandicoot if a parking lot deathmatch were to break out. While Crash has seen a big resurgence in the last few years, the mid-2000s were certainly a busy but nevertheless rough time for the wild-eyed apple-collecting enthusiast. Despite Sony publishing the first couple of titles in the series, it was Vivendi Universal who took control of the franchise, and if that seems eerily similar to what happened to Spyro the Dragon, that's because it is. It was literally the exact same thing.
I've ruined the lives of so many, I can't be expected to remember them all.
And much like Spyro, Vivendi wasn't really great in shepherding the character in the generations that followed, shuffling him around to several studios, implementing different gimmicks, art, and gameplay styles, which all resulted in a good half-dozen sequels that, varied in quality. Now, the first studio that had to fill in the big shoes of Naughty Dog was Traveler's Tales, with their freshman effort, The Wrath of Cortex. While not up to the standard of the original trilogy, it was obviously their first time handling the IP, and on brand new consoles no less. While we're all pretty familiar with Traveler's Tales' most recent legacy today, in the 90s and early 2000s they were behind a wide variety of titles, like the 16-bit versions of Bram Stoker's Dracula, Toy Story, Sonic 3D Blast and Sonic R, and of course Midway's seminal blockbuster fiasco, Haven: Call of the King.
Your existence has been a constant reminder of that mistake.
By the time the Crash IP was available, the UK-based studio was on the precipice of superstardom. The walls of their offices were swelling to account for all the work that was coming in from a litany of publishers. Their main Knutsford, England location was set to deliver 5 titles in 1 year, including their first one, which involved colorful little bricks or something, I don't know. Universal was looking to set up Crash in a new home, and thus Wrath of Cortex was born. But with so many other projects starting up and Universal keen to continue, Traveler's Tales decided to open up a second studio in Oxford for the express purpose of busting out more Bandicoot. That's a pretty good move in theory, opening up a smaller studio dedicated to, at that time, the biggest IP they had access to. But there was an issue. Traveler's Tales needed their most experienced staff to stay in Knutsford. Therefore, their greener employees, as well as a bunch of brand new hires, were sent to Oxford, with many of them having never shipped a game professionally before. Regardless, the team were still passionate about making the best title they could, but after 4 pretty similar mainline entries, there was a desire to go in a different direction this time around to stand out. So again, much like Spyro, their first inclination was to go for a darker, more serious tone than all the previous Crash games, as was the style at the time. People who grew up on Crash were growing up. It was the mid-2000s after all, and platformers were starting to erode against the incoming tide of stealth and action games flooding the market. So I guess from a marketing perspective, it made sense. The working title for the project was Crash Bandicoot Evolution. Ooh, that's a bad start. And was centered around the premise of 2 mutant parrots, aka the evil twins, stealing Crash's island and duct taping it to an orbiting planet of their own creation. Now, the word edgy gets thrown around a lot these days, but it very much was the term being used to describe what the team originally had wanted to do with the colorful, bouncy franchise. And that's really never not weird to say. Did no one really learn from Vex? Because while Jack and Ratchet were able to lean into that direction from time to time, it's still so strange to look at something like this and say, yeah, that needs to be darker and more serious. If that's what you want to go for, then just make a new franchise. I don't know, like Vex. Okay, that's a bad example. Jesus, why do I have Vex on the brain? Look, the point is, whenever you want to drastically change the tone of a long-running franchise, it carries with itself certain risks that are barely ever worth taking. While they had committed to the idea, the team were starting to get a tad nervous as they viewed the success of 2003's Ratchet & Clank Going Commando, which was pushing its title hero in a slightly older direction, coupled with its use of over-the-top weapons and destruction as being stiff competition if they pushed forward with Evolution's new tone. So rather than being compared to that, funded by Sony and being developed by the experienced hands at Insomniac, Traveler's Tales Oxford thought it best to rethink their approach. The entire project went back onto the drawing board, only keeping a few elements like the evil twins, but would now center around comedy, smushing Crash and Cortex into a team for an adventure only both of them could conquer together. It's the original Odd Couple! The staff thought it best to do the exact opposite of what the other big platformers like Jak, Ratchet, and Spyro were doing, while offering something distinct from Wrath of Cortex. Restarting from scratch, of course, had its drawbacks, as they would lose precious development time and have to prove to higher-ups at Vivendi Universal that this was the right choice for the project. In an interview with BeyondTwinsanity.com, art director Dan Tonkin outlined what they needed to do to make this happen. We basically threw out a lot of what we had built, which was neither working from a gameplay or technical standpoint, and re-engineered the game into a new demo level to present to a soon-to-arrive executive from Vivendi, who I understand was on a mission to cancel the project. Over about a 6-week period, we put together a demo with a more efficient approach in constructing the game and with a cleaner design. It worked out very well, and we managed to pull the game out of the fire and prevent it from being cancelled. It felt like a real achievement to keep the game alive and to see new potential in it. I remember it also pulled the team together well and gave us more cohesion as a studio for a while. This was a kind of beginning of the second phase of Crash Twinsanity, when the whole project took a new direction. At least that's how I remember it. Traveler's Tales looked to other properties like Ren and Stimpy and Jay and Silent Bob for the style and pacing they were looking to get out of Crash and Cortex, two vastly different personalities who would bounce off of each other. They also wanted that same comedic tone to carry over to other areas of the production, like the music, which was provided by the a cappella group Spiral Mouth and actually featured no traditional musical instruments, which was quite unique, as people like to say. Now, something that was in the design from the very beginning was an open world structure, letting the player wander from world to world with as little restrictions as possible. They had begun building out the game in this way, but all the concept art and assets that were made for Evolution had to be thrown out when they switched gears. This unfortunately meant that they wasted a lot of time, and as we know from our episode on Spyro, Vivendi wasn't in the business of delaying their games for very long, even if it meant it was worse for it. While they were supportive of this new direction, they absolutely could not miss the autumn/holiday shopping season, thus no extension was going to be given. In fact, the marketing department needed to get things rolling to begin, promoting the game. So in a call, they asked the heads of Traveler's Tales for the game's final title, and wanted that title within the hour. See, once they ditched Evolution, they were considering a few different subtitles such as Crash Unlimited, Crash Fully Fluxed, and Crash Twin Sane, but hadn't settled on a particular one just yet. If the team couldn't give an answer before the 60 minutes were up, Vivendi was going to go with the default, Unlimited, which, in my opinion, was the most forgettable of the three. With 5 minutes left to go, concept artist Keith Webb came up with Twinsanity, which, considering the new gimmick of the game, made the most sense and rolled off the tongue better than Twinsane. Working towards the looming release date was a frustrating time for the team, as you can imagine, with everyone wanting trying to make the best game possible, but having to cut out ideas, levels, and whole characters, while also finding quick solutions to bugs and issues to make it all work. Dan Tonkin recalled with Beyond Twinsanity this tough period in the game's life cycle. From my point of view, there was a lot of conflict throughout development. I was personally in many meetings where frustration, frayed tempers, and even outright anger was displayed over the way the game was being managed and the decisions that were being made. There was a pretty palpable tension between many members of the studio. Contrary to what a lot of people seem to believe about Twinsanity, the publisher, Vivendi Universal, were amazingly patient and supportive, I think above and beyond their obligations. The problems that faced the development of Crash Twinsanity were entirely a result of how Traveler's Tales operated internally. Some of that cut content was a stage taking place within Coco's mind, a cameo by Fake Crash, a good version of Cortex, and train and hoverboard levels, among others. Coco herself was set to be a playable character, but all of this had to be taken out simply because there wasn't enough time to properly implement it, or for far worse, buggier reasons. This then leads us to one of Twinsanity's biggest flaws. Even if you've seen them multiple times after a death and restart, there was no way to skip the game's many cutscenes. This was due to instability in earlier builds where you could skip them, but doing so would result in, take a guess, take a wild guess, yep, crashes. Tracking down the root cause of such an issue would be complicated and time-consuming, so they had to make the decision to remove the ability to skip them altogether. Pretty drastic, I know, but it was the only surefire way to solve the problem with the time that they had. I know I sound like a broken record at this point, but this is very similar to Spyro Enter the Dragonfly, where the holidays shopping season was seen as integral to the game's success.
Happy holidays, fat boy.
So Crash would follow the exact same death march towards the gaping maw of Christmas trees the world over. While many on the team had poured a lot of work into the game, just as much stuff didn't make it in. And to summarize how the Oxford studio felt about this overall, I'm going to turn to an anonymous employee who went under the name of Fake Nina to let us in. I think it was very challenging for us to make Twinsanity. It was our first game as a team, and for a lot of us, it was our first game period. Looking back now, I think that most of us feel it was a great experience and have a lot of affection for the game. I wouldn't say that we were happy with it, there's so many things we wanted to do and so many glitches, but I think we would all agree that it has a really great spirit to it, which I think was a result of the passion and energy the whole team put into Twinsanity. It feels like a handmade Crash Bandicoot game. Even when we were arguing, it was always about how we could make the game better. It feels like it was made with love. When the game finally did hit store shelves, the reception was enthusiastic mixed. While the game was competent in a lot of areas, with review outlets praising the new comedic style, the game's clearly unfinished nature, which was rife with plenty of bugs, wound up netting it very average reviews. What was also a factor was that there were far more impressive platformers being released around the same time, as well as a lot of competition in general. Try to remain shocked here, but Vivendi's insistence to cash in on the busy gaming season made sure that Crash was quickly buried under an avalanche of more high-profile releases.
Well, the past few years have kind of been slow. Wrath of Cortex didn't do as well as we'd hoped.
I'm talking about stuff like Sly 2, Band of Thieves, Mortal Kombat Deception, Paper Mario, The Thousand Year Door, Tony Hawk Underground 2, The Sims 2, and Def Jam Fight for Goddamn New York. All released less than a month around Twinsanity. So, despite the fresh new style, it wound up being the least successful mainline console Crash game ever produced, bested only by a few handheld entries. To their credit, Traveler's Tales viewed this as a learning experience, so with plenty of unused material and ideas, they started concepting and planning the next game in the series. Their idea was for Crash to get sucked into different TV channels / worlds, which would then lead to a huge variety of locales and set pieces with lots of comedic possibilities. There was going to be a black and white cartoon level, a western, a cooking show featuring Rusty Walrus, and even a hospital drama in the vein of ER. If this sounds a lot like Gex to you, that's because it does. Vivendi, however, was not married to this idea, because as we all know, you should never engage in premarital Gex.
Pardon my tongue, darling.
Reportedly, when presented with this pitch, the higher-ups at Vivendi rejected it outright and decided to go in a different direction, which was to have Radical Entertainment rush out Crash Tag Team Racing the very next year. And wouldn't you know it, it also happened to be on store shelves right before Christmas. Unfortunately, with the Crash franchise having been stripped from them, there wasn't really any reason for the Oxford studio to exist, so they were folded back into Traveler's Tale's main offices, whereupon they entered the mighty Lego mines, from which they would never return. Speaking of never returning, let's get back to Crash Bandicoot. Lamentably, Vivendi Universal would become part of Activision Blizzard, and despite critical and commercial success with the Insane Trilogy and It's About Time, it seems the massive, unfeeling conglomerate has also decided to go in a different direction. Since the release of Crash 4, its developer, Toys for Bob, has transitioned to working exclusively as a support studio on Call of Duty Warzone, and yeah, that's the end of the episode. If you know of any other platformers that are on a painfully perilous path, let me know in the comments below, over on my Twitter, or run towards the camera and into the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big boss and nominate what you'd like to see in a future episode. See you next time, and thanks for watching.